Hi everyone, I'm MJ Kinman. It's so good to be here at the National Quilt Museum, one of my favorite places on earth for about the past 3 decades. When my mom and I learned how to quilt in 1987 with our dear friend Gay Nordvik, who is our teacher, she said to us, we need to go to Paducah. And my mom and I both said, well, what's Paducah? And she goes, well, let's find out. So in 1988, we made our first trip down to Paducah, to the quilt show, and of course we made a stop here at the National Quilt Museum, and we've been coming ever since. So when I've come into this place, I love seeing all these wonderful quilts because for many of them, they're like old friends. And so you can understand how exciting it is for me to have my quilts here. When I first started quilting, I started coming here, and then I found my passion, and now I'm just so grateful for Rachel Barr and Frank and Becky for inviting me to have an exhibit here at the Corner Gallery. The quilts have been here since September 18th, and the show closes November 3rd, but hopefully this little snippet will give you a kind of a peek into the quilts. So I'd like to introduce you to some of my quilts. What we have here are my Bourbon Diamond series. The Bourbon Diamonds are obviously inspired by Kentucky's favorite export and favorite beverage. What I've really enjoyed about this particular series is the research. In this particular quilt, I actually went to Angel's Envy Distillery in Louisville, Kentucky on a cold December morning, a Monday morning, and yes, I drank bourbon at 11 in the morning because that's what you're supposed to do on a bourbon tour. What I loved about Angel's Envy is this incredible copper still that just reigns over the whole distillery. The main feature of any bourbon distillery is the still, right? People think, oh, this small little piece of equipment. No, these things are huge. And essentially what the still does is it captures all of the alcohol vapor that is created by the fermenting mash in the fermentation tanks, and as that vapor rises, then it condenses on the side of the still and it drops down into a tank, and it's the white distillate. That's the stuff that then they put in barrels and they put up in a rick house for 4 years, 2 years, 4 years, 12 years, 24 years, depending on what kind of flavor profile you're looking for. And so I fell in love with that particular still at Angel's Envy Distillery in Louisville. And I decided that I would pull my paints out and try to emulate the color of that copper. So I pulled all of my golds and ochres and cranberries and magentas and put it up on my frame that I used to paint my fabric and tried to emulate that. So this is my honor, my tribute, I guess, to the still that reigns over Angel's Envy. So one of the questions I get asked most often is, what kind of fabric do you use? Do you use solids, prints, do you Bally hand dyes? And the answer to that is yes. I use all of them. When I first started making my quilts, I was using solids because 1, it was easy, 2, I wasn't quite sure what else to use. Then I moved to prints, wasn't really happy with the technique or the effect that prints, P-R-I-N-T-S, created in my gemstones. Prints by and large they're divas, right? They call attention to themselves. And what I want people to do when they're looking at my quilts is to look at the whole gemstone and not just a piece of it. That's why I don't necessarily use prints as often as I do solids or gradations or hand dyes or hand-painted fabric. So you can see I wanted to have more control over the flow of light and color of my gemstone. So you can see here it goes from maybe a grayish purple down to a white. I wanted to create that, and the way I can do that is by hand painting my fabric. I use Jacquard Products Dynaflow fabric paint. It is like a watercolor paint, and it has a really nice hand to the fabric. It doesn't really change the hand to the fabric. So this is called Copper Queen. I'm going to tell you in a minute how a little bit about Angel's Envy Distillery and with another quilt that's on the other side of the gallery. But I thought I'd just keep going around. It's easier for Becky to film. Thanks, Becky, for doing this. This is called Kentucky Honey. She's inspired by Wild Turkey Distillery. They have a wonderful liqueur called American Honey. So I named this gal Kentucky Honey. Now I love contrasts, especially contrasts in color. And you'll see that a little bit around the gallery here. But you can see this little bit of lavender, and it just kind of peeks out among all of the yellow and the oranges, those are complementary colors. They're opposite each other on the color wheel. And I like to say, you know what Georgia O'Keeffe said about complementary colors, don't you? She said that colors who live next to each other on the color wheel are friends, but colors that live opposite each other on the color wheel are lovers. They make each other sing, right? And I just think that's so Georgia. This quilt in the corner, I am calling this the never-ending quilt. This was inspired by Jephthah Creed Distillery in Shelbyville, Kentucky. That's Jeptha. Second word is Creed, C-R-E-E-D. It's a relatively new bourbon, and it's a family-owned bourbon. The interesting thing about Jephthah Creed is that they use a corn called Bloody Butcher corn. It's a beautiful stalk of corn, a husk of corn that has red in it and a really distinct flavor profile. And of course, to make bourbon, it has to be 51% corn, right? And then they can put other grains in there, like rye, if you want a real spicy bourbon, or wheat, if you want a nice mellow, a really smooth mouthfeel for your bourbon. Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon, but rye makes it very spicy. And of course, you can put other grains in there, like barley. The yeast loves barley. They just go crazy, and it also helps them create that fermentation a little bit faster. But back to Bloody Butcher Topaz. This is inspired by topaz, an imperial topaz from the Smithsonian National Gem Collection. I created her specifically so that I could have something to work on when I went to Quilt Market and Quilt Festival, and in between working, talking to people, I could sit there and I could stitch. You'll see, instead of doing my machine quilting like I normally love to do, this is all hand done. I put her in a hoop, and I take embroidery floss, and I do these little tiny textural stitches. It's not a regular running quilt stitch. You can't really do that very well in my gemstones because of all the little seams, way too much, and my hands begin to hurt. And I break needles. So I end up putting this into a hoop, and I have all my threads of all different colors, and I just love stitching. It's very meditative. So you can see I've got a good amount in there, but there's still some places. So I think, you know, I probably have another 20 years to work on her. But meanwhile, we'll let her live at the National Quilt Museum. This is called Fire and Ice. She's inspired by Buffalo Trace Distillery. Buffalo Trace Distillery is in Frankfort, Kentucky, on the Kentucky River. Buffalo Trace gets its name from the old trails that the migrations of buffalo would follow. They followed the salt licks that were part of the limestone geological structures here in Kentucky. And that's how come Kentucky has such great bourbon. It's because of the rocks. People think it's the water, but the rocks came first. The limestone rocks, basically that water runs through the limestone rocks, and the limestone removes the impurities out of that water, especially iron. And iron will just ruin a good bourbon. Basically, it makes it kind of skunky and yucky. So when we have water that's run through that limestone, it basically purifies the water, and so you get a really nice bourbon. And that's why we have so many wonderful bourbon distilleries and bourbon makers all the way up into the northeastern part of the state, up in Maysville, where Old Pogue Distillery is. And then it runs down through Frankfort, and you have Buffalo Trace, and then through the center part of the state, where you have, you know, Maker's Mark, Woodford Reserve, Four Roses, Jim Beam, all those wonderful iconic bourbons. So in this particular case, I was really trying to go for a little bit more abstract look. In many of my early quilts, you'd see that I was trying to do diamonds with all the edges showing, because I thought that's the only way people are going to know that they're gemstones. So once I realized, okay, maybe they're kind of looking like gemstones, I thought I would make it a little bit more abstract. And so again, this symbolizes the bourbon with the firm foundation of the Kentucky River underneath. So let me introduce you to Devil's Due. Devil's Due is inspired by Jim Beam bourbon, and also a big cushion cut diamond that was cut by, I'm blanking on the name, Lawrence Graff. He's a very famous jeweler from London, England, but he had this big yellow gemstone in one of the books that I have of him, and I thought, that's cool, and I want to make a quilt of it. It's yellow, but you can see I took great liberties in using some of the color because I love contrast, right? I love the purple and the blue and a little bit of the gold just to give it a little bit more zorch. This, I just want to, people often ask, how do you put these things together? Well, these are just block quilts. It's just that the blocks in my quilts are a little wonky shaped. So these are really traditional block quilts with just strange looking blocks. And what I'd like to do is draw your attention to the way I actually block them out or segment them out. It's all about the faceting pattern. Now there are thousands of faceting patterns out there, but if you find the faceting pattern, basically the way the gem cutter took the rough gemstone and shaved parts off of it so that the light would basically disperse. Once you find that faceting pattern, you can find your piecing structure, your piecing strategy, or as I like to call with my gemophiles and my students, your piece plan. So let me show you the facets of this particular gemstone. So here, do you see where you have a quadrilateral right here? Do you see how the light kind of breaks in this big kind of quadrilateral kite-shaped piece? That's a block. That's called a bezel facet or a kite facet in gemological terms. And once you find the first bezel facet, you can find all of them because they simply hold hands as they run around the edge of the diamond. So there's the first one. Okay, so let's look at the edge here. And look, it's holding hands with the next one, right? That's the next one. And then here's the edge and it's holding hands with the next one. So once you find the bezel facets, you can find all the other facets. Let's connect the toes of the bezel facets. So let's see. That's the point of one, and it comes down and touches the toes of the other the bezel facet. It pops around, turns the corner, touches the toes here, etc. You've got all the facets now. Here's the table facet, the star facets, the bezel facets, and the girdle facets. This table facet, I like to segment even into smaller and smaller sections because it's called eating the elephant, right? One bite at a time. When you start looking at these quilts as put two facets together and then put two units together and then put into sections and then put sections together, they literally begin to grow and bloom in front of your eyes. So this is Devil's Due. What else do I want to tell you about this quilt? Oh, this is the second version. The first version was an epic fail, right? I wanted to experiment with maybe pieces fused on. And what I didn't realize that when you hit a piece of fabric on some fusible facing, it shrinks. And so I had all of these little dark lines in between each one of them. And I'm like, I don't like that. So I pitched it. I decided to create another one, piecing it, and I think the second one, it kind of turned out. So this is called Old Fashioned New. Old Fashions are one of my favorite cocktails. This is inspired by Willett Distillery. Willett Distillery lives in Bardstown, Kentucky. I again wanted to do more abstract work, and this is symbolizing the angle of the incredible, the beautiful lines of the distillery, as well as the cobblestone of the actual distillery wall. That's the inspiration for that piece. And what's really fun about what the folks have done at the National Quilt Museum is they have included images of each one of the distilleries that are part of that have inspired the quilts. All right, let's see, what else? Oh, okay. We've got Maker's Flame here. This is a quilt that's 9 feet tall, about 4.5 feet wide, and she was commissioned by Rob Samuels, who is the 3rd generation owner of Maker's Mark, kind of a famous bourbon that lives in Loretto, Kentucky. He came to me and said, I would love to have one of your quilts at the distillery, and so he commissioned the quilt, and so this normally lives in Loretto, Kentucky at Maker's Mark, but they graciously let us borrow it for this exhibit. What I wanted to do, she was inspired not only by Maker's Mark, but by a beautiful flame-colored topaz. And I wanted this to look like either a bourbon-infused flame or a flame-infused drop of bourbon. The interesting thing about Maker's Mark is their story has a lot to do with fire in different ways. For example, when Bill Samuels Sr., who invented Maker's Mark, He brought the whole family into a conference room with this big copper bucket on the table. And he took the old mash bill, he said just lousy mash bill bourbon that they used to make, and he was going to create a new mash bill. Mash bill is the term for recipe. It essentially is the recipe of all the different combinations of grain that you use to make your flavor profile, that you bubble and cook, and then it goes up through the still. So what he wanted to do, he said, I'm going to create a brand new bourbon, we're not going to do this anymore. He set it on fire, and he was going to throw it into the copper bucket, but at that same time, his little daughter looked into the copper bucket. The flaming mash bill hit her hair and set her hair on fire. Mama Marge was like, why in the world did you do that? So Marge, by the way, was the woman who was his wife, and she's the person who invented the red drip wax that comes down. She was the marketing expert of the family. So there you go. Marge, he did the brawn, she had the brains, is what I say. Okay, here's a quilt called Angel Share. This is also inspired by the same distillery that inspired Copper Queen. Angel Share, I ask my audiences when I do trunk shows and my classes if they know what the term angel share means. And a lot of people do, but I want to share with you, angel share basically is a term used by producers of adult beverages that you put in barrels or tanks, and then maybe you put those barrels up on a rick house or you put them down in the cellar, and you let them cook for a little while, you let them age for a little while. When you take that barrel down and you open it, a portion of it has evaporated. That's called the angel share. Now, Lincoln Henderson was the person who started Angel's Envy. It's a relatively new bourbon in Louisville, Kentucky. He was the master distiller at Brown-Forman for many, many years, and he retired. But he said, you know what, I'm not done yet. He wanted to make a bourbon that was so good, the angels would not be satisfied with their share. They'd be envious of what was in the barrel. So he called his bourbon Angel's Envy. It's a really good bourbon too. It'll set you back about 50 bucks a bottle. It's worth it. Okay, so again, you can see how I love complementary colors. I put this electric blue next to the yellows. And again, I want to share with you the technique that I use. I use freezer paper to put these together. Freezer paper is that wonderful substance that you can write on one side, and then the other side has a plasticky substance that when you lay it on fabric and hit it with a hot iron, it adheres to the fabric. And then you can pull it off and it doesn't leave a residue. You can put it back on, hit it with an iron, you can reuse it. So literally, this is not foundation paper piecing. I don't sew to paper, there's no flip and sew, you don't have to claw the paper out of the back of the quilt top when you're done. This literally is traditional piecing using freezer paper as your template. So if you can put two pieces of fabric together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can do this kind of quilting. And I teach the technique too. And it's a lot of fun. Truly, people, as they're putting their facets together, unit by unit, they start looking at each other going, this isn't hard, this is easy. And I'm like, I know, don't tell anybody. They'll think you're a rock star. And so I'm going to go ahead and drop in an image here where you can see part of the quilt is done, and then you'll see the chart in the other one. So perhaps I can share that with Becky and the good folks at National Quilt Museum. All right. And the last quilt that I want to share with you is called Char Number 4. Char Number 4 is inspired by a product, a Brown-Forman product called Old Forester. Now Brown-Forman is known for the fact that they make their own barrels. They have their own cooperage, right? Most other bourbon companies use a company called International Stave Company, but Brown-Forman has their own, and I wanted to draw attention to that. When you create bourbon, actually one of the definitions of bourbon, one of the regulations around calling something a bourbon is, again, it has to be 51% corn, and it has to go into new oak barrels, brand new, right? And before they put that white distillate, remember we talked about white distillate when we were talking about Copper Queen, before they put that white distillate in, they actually shoot fire into the barrel. They set that thing on fire. Now it does two things. One, it toasts the inside of the barrel, and in the hot Kentucky summers, when that barrel is resting in the rick house, and that bourbon expands into the wood, right? It's going to expand. It interacts with the molecules of that wood. and it picks up the flavor profile that the master distiller is looking for. And then in the cold Kentucky winters, it contracts and it comes back into the barrel and it brings that beautiful amber and honey or vanilla or whatever the flavor profile is. And it's all basically because it's interacted with the molecules of the wood. The second thing that they do, the reason that they shoot fire into the barrels before they put the distillate in, is to char it. Now, charcoal does something very important. It removes even more impurities from the white distillate. If you are familiar with Tennessee whiskey, when they take Tennessee whiskey, they actually pour it through maple charcoal. Same concept. It removes the impurity from that distillate before they barrel it. And so when you have the distillate in a barrel and the insides are charred and that bourbon, that distillate is moving in and out of the wood through that char, it's removing the impurities. This little gemstone that had a lot of flame-colored imagery to it and facets to it. And then I put this little blue flame all the way around it because the fires of hell burn with a fine blue flame, right? Now there is one other quilt that is not here. It is on the cover of my new book. It's called Between River and Sky. It's inspired by Old Pogue Distillery, which lives in the upper northeast of Kentucky. She is actually at another museum in Indiana right now, so she's missing her sisters. But I just wanted to share with you that there's one more quilt out there. Speaking of the book, you can actually get the book here at National Quilt Museum. It's called Gemstone Quilts, Creating Fire and Brilliance in Fabric Step by Step. A little bit of a mouthful. Just think of gemstone quilts. So I'm going to be signing some books, and so if you want to stop in and pick up a book, that would be lovely. Or you can visit my website. Oh, by the way, the National Quilt Museum website is www.quiltmuseum.org. And they have also wonderful things online that you can purchase there as well, if you can't make it in. Or you can purchase the book or any of my patterns at www.mjkinman.com. Thanks so much for letting me share with you a little bit about my gems. It's been a real treat and a real delight to be here. I wish you well, be safe, and shine on.